Hey, Reverend Kim and Kathleen. Sawubona and good evening. Amen. Hey there, Deacon Mike. Sawubona. We'll give it a couple of more minutes and we will get started. Hey, Giovanni Sawubona. I refuse to watch the impeachment trial. I don't need the drama, but I pick up little tidbits from the news clips and from what people say. Y'all can have the drama. I'll wait for the results because I got a pretty good idea about how one group of people are going to respond. They ain't gonna change. Hey, Patricia, Sawubona. Yeah, so even though it was on all of the TVs, and yeah, this is a historic moment. Um, hey, Trish, Sawubona. Even though it is a historic moment, no president has ever been impeached twice, and a whole bunch of stuff that's never happened before. Hey, Annette, Sawubona. Annette Williams and Annette Smith. Yeah, yeah, Giovanni. Yeah, which group is that? Yeah, I refuse to. Yeah, the process is it is an education, Mike. Um, it is, and so it is benefit. It's just that my constitution will not allow me to subject myself to it to get the process. Hey, Charlene and Vivian Taylor, Sawubona, greetings to you. So y'all keep me up on hey Sanchez, Sawubona, greetings. Yeah, y'all keep me up on the shenanigans that a particular party whose leader was so incensed. Hey Ruthie Sawubona, a particular party whose leader was so incensed, he said he was happy to have the impeachment, and then he voted against carrying on with the impeachment. Yeah, these scoundrels, they are not they ain't real, and they ain't got no God in them, y'all. These scoundrels don't have a God anywhere other than the God um, who Jesus said rules the air. Sawubona Angel, good to see you. You've been missing in action the last few weeks, and I called you out. Hey, we can get started, y'all. Um, we got a quorum. Join me in a word of prayer. Dear God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your presence. We thank you for these who have gathered and who are gathering via virtual YouTube and Facebook Live. So we ask, as always, that you give insight, understanding, that you give clarity. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. Yeah, Giovanni, the lover of the money. Money, 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 money. So we have been walking through portions of, hey, Robert Gordon, Sawubona to you too, sir. We have been walking through portions of Exodus during this Black History Month. It is in many ways fitting that as Carter G. Woodson asked us to do, to begin to reflect and remember how we got over, as the old hymn of the church says, how I got over. And so, looking at the Exodus, I wanted to lift up a passage from Exodus. We're going to be in Exodus 12 tonight. Exodus 12 tonight. If someone would be so kind on the YouTube and on the Facebook to tap in on the chat line, Exodus 12 verses 1 through 14. But in your quiet moments, read the entire 12th chapter of Exodus. It does constitute the context out of which we are examining tonight. But I just want to lift up the first 14 verses. Thank you, Sanchan. If somebody on the Facebook Live will post that Exodus 12, 1 through 14. Greetings, Diane Sawubona. So I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version of the 11th century via Hebrew Masoretic text. That NRSV says these words. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month, they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in portions to the number of people who eat of it. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male lamb. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat. They shall eat the lamb that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roast it over the fire with its head, legs, and inner organs. You shall let none of it remain until morning. Anything that remains until morning, you shall burn. This is how you shall eat it. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord, for I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be a day of remembrance for you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. Throughout your generations, you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading and hearing of his word. Thank you so much, Shirlene and Annette, for posting that. So those are the instructions that God gave to Moses to give to the people about how God was going to bring them out of their out of their subjugation in Egypt. God gave them instructions, and the part of the instructions that were part of their deliverance were to be perpetually practiced for all time. It was an ordinance, it was an instruction, it was a remembrance that they were to remember what God had done. So we know we've been working on this, that God called Moses out of Midian. Moses had been in Midian 40 years. He had been in Egypt 40 years. And then when he realized that the murder he committed had been known, Moses left Egypt in a hurry. And he escaped to the place called Midian. He married a Cushite by the name of Zipporah, the daughter of a priest whose name was Jethro. Some translations have him the name Ruel. He married Zipporah, became a shepherd. He went from a priest to being a shepherd. Yes, as I said, he remained in Midian 40 years. And when he was 80 years old, while on the backside of a mountain in Midian, tending his father-in-law's sheep, he saw a bush that burned, but it did not get consumed by the fire. We looked at, he approached it. The voice of God came from the bush. Moses, Moses, take off your shoes, for you are on holy ground. And then God interacted with Moses, telling him who he was and what he must do. God said, I have seen the misery of my people. God said, I've heard their cries to be free. God said, I have felt their pain. And I've come down to do something about it. So Moses, get going back to Egypt. And so we know that Moses goes back to Egypt, and Moses repeats the words through his brother Aaron because he had a stutter problem. Incidentally, as a footnote, it doesn't matter what limitation we think we have. God can use our limitations to lift up the reverence of God in the lives of other people. Never let what society or what physical challenges we may have be a limitation, and let us not ever look on anybody who has what we might call a limitation as if they cannot be prominent in serving God and having an impact on the people of God. So Moses' brother Aaron did most of the talking. Aaron repeated what Moses got from God to Pharaoh. Let my people go so that they can worship me on this mountain, the mountain in Midian, which was Sinai, but it's also called Horeb. it's important that I say that, because when you go to 1 Kings, the 18th and 19th chapter, Elijah the prophet, in particular in the 19th chapter, flees to Mount Horeb, but it is also Mount Sinai. And so we know the story. Pharaoh, Horeb, Horeb, Sinai, Sinai. We know that Pharaoh, depending on what translation you have, it will say that God told Moses, Pharaoh's not going to let you go. I've hardened his heart. And so I had an extensive discussion with someone on that just yesterday. That God hardened Pharaoh's heart. You got it, Diane. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Does that mean that God made Pharaoh refuse to let the people go? No. When it's saying God hardened Pharaoh's heart, or some translations will say Pharaoh's heart was hardened, it is, I use the illustration. Sometimes you can show compassion and love and appreciation to a person, and somebody else observing it will get mad because they feel that they should get that attention. America is wrestling with how to respond to the horrible treatment that Black people have experienced in this nation. This is a ancillary illustration to the first one I just gave. And so in America wrestling with trying to repay and repair the damage done to Black people in this nation, there are white people in this nation who are mad. They're mad because of a number of reasons, a bunch of which is a whole nother discussion. But they get mad, and they get so mad that they get mean and evil. They bomb churches in Birmingham. They stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021. They do all kinds of heinous and hateful things because they're mad that the wrongs done by their ancestors and that they have benefited from now are being addressed and trying to be redressed. You're absolutely right, Shirlene. And so America, in particular under Trump, has resembled Pharaoh. So it wasn't that God made Pharaoh refuse to let the people go. Pharaoh's heart was hardened because God was stepping in and showing compassion to the Israelite people. Exactly, like the chicken coming home to roost. Got Malcolm in trouble, but it was the truth. Some people can't take the truth, and some people look like you can't take the truth. And so Pharaoh, y'all know the story when you read Exodus. The plague of flies just gets under my skin. That the flies were so thick they were flying up people's noses and getting in people's ears, and people couldn't take a bite of food without a fly being either on the food or in the food, and then they get to chewing and a fly is in their mouth. It was horrible, y'all. And then gnats got in the ears and got in the noses and were irritating the eyes, and a person take a drink of water and gnats would be all in the water. It was horrible, y'all. And frogs, and y'all know there were all these plagues that God sent. And Pharaoh would get irritated And then he would tell Moses, come in here. Tell God to stop. Tell your God to stop. I'll let your people go. And the minute that there would be a little brief break, Pharaoh would say, I tricked you, psych. I ain't letting nobody go. And so y'all know that went on and on and on until the last plague. And this is where we are now. The last plague, where Pharaoh got so mad, he didn't want Moses to come into his presence anymore. He'd kill him. And so it was his words that actually ushered in the last plague. And the last plague was death. Death of the firstborn, whether animals or humans. And so here we are at a moment, I call it a precipice of promise. The people of God are about to be delivered. They have been 400 years in subjugation, in slavery, in Egypt. 400 years. And here they are on the precipice of promise. And I just read to you what God said about how they now are to begin to actualize what is about to happen. And it is encapsulated in what we call the Passover. And the Passover is a observance. Some would call it a religious observance. And it's okay. You can call it a religious observance, but it's not really a religious observance. It is a political, social, and civic and cultural occurrence that is also religious. Remember, God didn't come down because Pharaoh would not let people worship Yahweh. That's not why God came down. God didn't intercede because Pharaoh told the people, you can't pray anymore. God didn't come down because the Egyptians were telling the people, you can't practice your faith anymore. They were practicing their faith. They were praying. That's how God heard them. They were praying to God. They were practicing their faith. God didn't come down because they were being hindered religiously. God came down because they were being oppressed physically, which was politically for monetary gain. That's why God said he came down. God said, I have seen the suffering of my people. I have listened to their cries of pain, and I feel their pain. Their pain has touched my heart. And I've come down to do something about it. And so the Passover is not a religious observance. It is a religious, political, social, civic, cultural observance. Incidentally, as a footnote, there is no African language, the languages that are on the continent. There is no African language that has a word for religion. Did you hear me? There is no African language that has a word for religion. Why is that important? I'm glad you asked. Because religion is not a thing you practice. Faith is not something you practice. It is what you are. And so politics, education, economics, culture, all of that are a part of who you are that is reflected in how you live out your faith. One of the damages that we have gotten from European mindset is that we are practicing our religion. And that is anti-African. We are an African people. You don't have your religious practices over here and your business practices over here and your political practices over there, and what you do at home is over here. No, it's all together under how you honor God. And so Passover is not a religious practice per se. It is a cultural, it is a political, it is a civic, it is a social, and it is a faith practice. It is how you live out your faith to God. And so God instructs them on this night to be delivered for the death angel, from the death angel. The death angel is going to pass through Egypt. And the death angel is going to strike down the firstborn. And so Moses is instructed to tell the people, you need to get a lamb or a goat. Get a lamb or a goat. It has to be firstborn. It has to be male. It has to be without blemish. You must take that lamb or goat. You have to slaughter it. And after you slaughter it, you have to take the blood from it. You drain the blood. And you use that blood as a sign by putting it on the door frame. And then you eat a meal. And the meal consists of roasted lamb or goat, along with, you're getting ahead of me, Giovanni. That's good. That's good. And the meal consists of roasted lamb or goat. It can't be boiled and it can't be raw. Roasted lamb or goat. You have to have herbs that are bitter to taste. Why? Because they represent the bitterness of being in bondage in Egypt. And you have to eat bread that doesn't have yeast in it, unleavened bread. Why? Because on this night, you are going to be free. You can't dilly-dally in Egypt. You can't walk downtown Egypt and look at the movie houses and the theaters and all of the businesses and observe them. You can't pal around in Egypt and waste time. No more Egypt. You are being delivered from it. Leave it. Now, the only thing you will do, and I went over this a couple of weeks ago, Egypt got to pay you reparations. So God says he put on the hearts of the Egyptians and told the Israelites, the women, take all the gold and silver from Egypt you can. All that you can carry is reparations. So, exactly, specific instructions. And so you're eating the unleavened bread because you can't wait for the bread to rise. No yeast in the bread, flat bread. And you're eating it fully clothed. You got all your clothes on, and you're eating it in a hurry. You're gobbling down your food. You're not necessarily sitting down unless it's a problem standing for a long time. But you are standing up. You're eating the food in a hurry because you are being delivered from Egypt. And so that was the process. And then God said, but you don't do this for one night. You do this on this specific date, this month. And Passover was it's a spring celebration. It lasted 7 days. God said it should last 7 days. It is a festival. It is a celebration. It is a remembrance that should last 7 days. And it's in the spring. It happens March and April. And it is for all of the people. And the festival celebrated and commemorated the Israelites' liberation from slavery in Egypt. And so that's where, the name Passover comes from. That's where the Passover meal comes from. Because when the death angel came through Egypt, any house that did not have the blood of the lamb, that firstborn in that house got struck dead. But if God saw the blood, God passed over that house and they were spared. And so Giovanni got a little bit ahead of me, because you're absolutely right. Jesus celebrated, incidentally, the Passover every day of his life. The Passover, because it was a memorial, a remembrance that is to be practiced forever, continuously, perpetual. And that's important. And I'm gonna come to more of the importance in a minute. And so Jesus practiced celebrating the Passover. And we know through the Gospels that he did that. And just before he died in particular, he shared the Passover meal. And the Passover meal that Jesus shared was elevated because the last Passover was elevated by his presence, because he was firstborn. He is called the Lamb of God. He's male. Jesus was without blemish, without defect. He had never sinned. Jesus was murdered, slaughtered. Jesus was hung. And the blood of Jesus delivers us. And so that's why the blood still works, y'all. But here it is. What you don't find is that after the Israelites are delivered from slavery, they are never slaves. What did I just say? In other words, when they remember what God did, they don't remember themselves as slaves. They don't associate themselves as coming from, here it is, this is it. They don't associate themselves as coming from slaves. They associate themselves as having been enslaved at one time, but they did not come from slaves. Are you listening to me? They had been enslaved, but forevermore, as the people afterwards and the generations after that, when they remembered it, they didn't remember that we came from slaves. No, they came from people who were started by Abraham and Sarah. They came from a people whom God had partnered with. They came from a people who had done miraculous and incredible things. And they always remembered themselves that way. They did not come from slaves. This is important. Because as we remember what has happened to our people here in America, KKK, and how we have been enslaved in chattel slavery, I raised this up as a correction on how we have associated ourselves. Many people today that look like you and me associate us as having come from slaves. And so for many people, many in your family, many in my family, associate our journey as beginning in slavery. There's in the minds of many of our people that we are a broken people because of slavery. There is in the minds of many of our people that our ancestors who were enslaved accepted the institution of slavery and accepted the identification of themselves as slaves. Even though, you're right, Giovanni, all of us know that we are descendants of Africa, it gets washed away in many, if not most of our people's minds, because we have been oriented and brainwashed to see ourselves as coming from slaves. Now, in the scriptures, one of the reasons why our ancestors gravitated to the Exodus so strongly, go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. It was a accurate description of our journey that seemed to be represented in the journey of the Israelites, these Africans, Black African Israelites, as they were going through Egypt. And so that is one of the reasons why our ancestors enslaved in chattel slavery gravitated to the Exodus. Pharaoh's army drowned in the Red Sea. This Sunday sermon, we're gonna touch on this. So let me leave that alone for a moment. But our people use Exodus and Moses and the Israelites and Pharaoh as reference. And if we use it as reference, what we see and what ought to be reflected and reminded and remembered in our minds is we didn't come from slaves. Our people were enslaved, but our people were not slaves. It is an exhaustive and in-depth examination of the African American spirituals. Some call them the Negro spirituals, and some call them sorrow. W.E.B. Du Bois, in one of the chapters in his book, he labeled them sorrow songs. But the late John Lavelle Jr. wrote a book. It's extremely wealthy with wisdom on the African American spirituals. The book is called Black Song, The Forge and the Flame. the story of how the African American spiritual was hammered out. Very powerful book. I just love the title of it. It's called Black Song, The Forge and the Flame. The story of how the African American spiritual was hammered out. And so he has a place in there where he references Booker T. Washington, and he takes a citation from Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up from Slavery. And this is what Booker T. Washington said, because remember, Booker T. Washington was born in the midst of chattel slavery. And so this is what he says in his work, Up from Slavery. This section is in John Lavell's book. Booker T. Washington testifies in his autobiography these words. He says, as the great day, and that would be the end of the Civil War, as the great day drew nearer, he says, there was more singing in the slave quarters. There was more singing than usual. It was bolder, he said. It had more ring and lasted later into the night. Most of the verses of the plantation songs had some reference to freedom. He says, true, they had sung those same verses before, but they had been careful to explain that the freedom in the songs referred to the next world, referred to heaven. Now they gradually, that night, as the great day, at the end of the war approached, he said, they gradually threw off the mask and were not afraid to let it be known that the freedom in their songs meant freedom of the body in this world. The songs that we call the Negro spirituals or the African American spirituals were not sorrow songs, and they were not songs about heaven. I'm going to get into this Sunday in the sermon. They were songs that were created by our people right on the spot. When you look at the spirituals, there is no author, because the whole community of Black folk, they were authors. They were all authors. Somebody would strike up a line, I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes. Somebody else would say, when I get to heaven, gonna put on my shoes and walk all over God's heaven. And the whole community would throw in a line here or there. And so the community created the song, but they also created the song with in mind that we talking about freedom. That the songs were about liberation. The songs were about getting free. So they would talk about heaven, and they weren't talking about dying and going somewhere in the cosmos. They were talking about getting free, going up north where slavery was not as prevalent. I hate to say it was not. There were areas up north that were horrible places. But they're in their mindset, if we get free and get to the north, that's in the song. That's heaven. And so Booker T. Washington pointed out that they would talk about freedom in the spirituals. But before they got word that the war was fighting to end it, they would make sure that slave owners and slave drivers would be convinced that they were talking about going to heaven. It's called code language. It's code language. And so Booker T points out that they got bolder the closer to the end of chattel slavery in America. They began to sing bolder and louder and later. And they began to take off the mask and begin to show, no, we talking about getting up out of here. We've been talking about getting up out of here all along. We just couldn't let you know. And what that demonstrates is that our ancestors never assented, never accepted being a slave. They never gave in their spirits. They were enslaved. Their bodies were shackled. They were forced to work without pay for other people. But they never accepted the instant you are a slave. They were fighting it at every opportunity they could, which is why they created songs to sing, songs that would lift their spirits and strengthen their backs, and songs that would strategically alert them to when a group would be making their way off the plantation. And so we didn't come from slaves. We came from people who had been enslaved. One of the spirituals in particular, Oh Freedom, there's a line in it, and it's a very powerful line. And the line says, and before I be a slave, stop right there. It says, and before I be a slave. It doesn't say before I be a slave anymore. It doesn't say before I accept being a slave very long. It says before I be a slave. In other words, I'm being forced to work in these cane fields. I'm being forced to work in these cotton fields. I'm being forced to do this labor for nothing. I'm being whipped. I'm being beaten. My family has been taken away from me when I was on the auction block, incidentally, when they took away those brown babies at the border and put those babies in cages and sent their parents back home. And some folks, especially white folks, said, this is not us. Hey, this is exactly who this country is. They did it with our people, and they've been doing it all along. And so before I be a slave, before I will accept being a slave, before I will give in with my spirit, before I will let my heart give in to this institution, before I will let my mind wrap around being identified as a slave, before I be a slave, they said, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. I will never, ever accept being a slave. And I am willing to die if it need be before my spirit will be broken, before I will allow my mind to accept it, before I will allow my heart to begin to embrace it. Before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. That's a spiritual that they sang. Because we didn't come from slaves, just like the Israelites in Egypt. They never identified themselves as coming from slaves. They remembered that their ancestors had been enslaved, but they didn't come from slaves. Their history, their legacy, their lineage, their heritage went beyond slavery. It was an interruption of their journey, just like chattel slavery in this nation has been an interruption. It's very important because we have had generations. Now, I lift up to you. And don't just say Kanye West is off his rocker. Kanye West represented a lot of the thought of a lot of people. Remember what he said? How you gonna be enslaved for 300 years if you don't want to be a slave? Kanye West said that. That's in the mind of a majority of our people. Well, a great many of our people. Some of them are in your family and in my family. And we want to act like it's not real. It is real. Which is why the Passover remembrance was so important. And that is why anytime we do something to remember what happened to us and then how we got through it, white people in particular in America get upset. And then black folk that want to make white folk happy, they get upset. Why you got to remember all of that? Why you got to exaggerate? Why you got to talk about all of that? It wasn't that bad. It couldn't have been that bad. It couldn't have been that horrendous. Who would accept that? Why we got to talk about that? Why we got to go back to that? Because you ain't paid no reparations yet. But we must always remember it, not that we came from slavery, but we remember what God did to get us through it. So that we will never let it happen again. So that our people will never get in their minds that we came from slaves. So that our people will never associate our journey as having begun in slavery. We got work to do. And so God instituted a Passover so that people would begin to cleanse their minds and cleanse their thoughts and cleanse their hearts of the damage done being enslaved. And so the Passover reminds us that you were never slaves. You were enslaved. But you were never slaves. You are survivors and thrivers. Your people never gave assent to being a slave. They fought it at every point, with every fiber. They fought it as best they could. They didn't have the wherewithal to just have a continuous uprising. And so they planned for periodic uprisings. There were hundreds of uprisings. They didn't tell you that in the classroom, did they? When they talked about chattel slavery in America, they didn't tell you about the hundreds of uprisings. They didn't tell you that. But the first point is that we were never slaves. We were enslaved, but we were never slaves. We are survivors and thrivers of the enslavement period. Point 2, that you are not a broken people, but you are a blessed people and a beloved people. When I was on a radio spot on WLTH, there was a gentleman that would call in consistently, especially when I was on. But it wasn't just me. He called in on everybody. And he would call in and he would say, we are a cursed people. He would say, black people in America are a cursed people because we have offended and run afoul of God, and God cursed us. That's why we have it so bad. That's why we got it so bad. That's why we have gone through so much. He would try to push back on me with that all the time. And he is not an isolated incident. There are a lot of black people who think that we are a cursed people, who think that because we are on the negative of just about every indicator in this nation, that God is not pleased and God is upset and that God has abandoned us and God has cursed us. There are a lot of our people that believe that. That's why some of our people will bleach their skin. They will They will have their cosmetic surgery to change the feature of their noses. There is a powerful exposition of this done by Bill Duke. Created this video presentation called Dark Girls, and some of you have seen it, and it's kind of old now. Came out, I guess, around 2012 or whatever. But Dark Girls, and he talks about colorism. he talked about in there, you know, the colorism that has gone through our people that came from white folk who were separating us and dividing us among one another, because white men would go into the slave quarters and have sex with black women, and the babies sometimes, a lot of times, would come out lighter skinned. That's colorism. The colorism means it privileges and prefers one color of skin over another. And so in Louisiana, you had this thing, crazy stuff called octoroons and quadroons and etc. In other words, somebody was 1/8 African and 1/16 African. In other words, they were dividing our people. And so this thing, and Dark Girls, if you haven't seen it, you got to watch it. Shows how we have been conditioned to think that those that have lighter skin will get the jobs. It shows, it talks about how people in our community, when they would fill out an application, if they weren't doing it or they were trying to get an interview for a job, they would put on the application fair complexion, lighter complexion, thinking that the person that was reading the application would take kindly because they would be lighter complexion. Some of you are old enough to remember the paper bag test, and to get in certain civic and social organizations, you would be given the paper bag test, the brown paper bag test. If you were darker than a brown paper bag, then you would be excluded from the group. And so there are people in our community who think we are a broken people, a cursed people. No, the Israelites never saw themselves as a broken people, as a cursed people, because of enslavement in Egypt, and they got enslaved in Babylon also. They got enslaved hundreds of years later in Babylon, but they never saw themselves as a broken people, as a cursed people. Many of our people see ourselves that way. And so we are not a broken people. We have been damaged by the institution of chattel slavery. We have been damaged by white supremacy. We have been damaged by race hatred in this nation. But we are not a broken people. We are a blessed people and a beloved people, because no other person on the planet who has ever lived has had to endure what we have had to endure. No other person on the planet has ever had to endure the institution of chattel slavery. Yes, there has been slavery throughout history, but people that have been enslaved because of wars could often were set free, or they rose up in the hierarchy of whatever the community that they had been enslaved were. They were never seen as property. Chattel slavery tried to identify us with property. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 2 says that Black African people are 3/5 of human, not fully human, only 3/5. And that reason is for taxation purposes. We are not fully human, according to America KKK. And so we are not a broken people. We are a blessed and beloved people because no other people have had to endure what we have had to endure and are still here, still surviving, still thriving, and still achieving. Nobody else like you, baby. Nobody else, no other people on the planet have ever lived through what you have lived through, what your ancestors have lived through. We are the only people that have had to endure this and come through it. And so, no, we were not slaves, first point. We were enslaved, but we're not slaves. We're survivors and thrivers. We're not a broken people. We are a blessed people and a beloved people because no other people have endured what we have had to endure, and that was by God's mighty hand. That's why we are beloved people. When God told Moses, I have seen the misery of my people. I heard their cries of pain. I feel their pain. I come down to do something about it. God was showing these people are beloved by me. And then finally, we are not an orphan people, but we are a people of history, a people of destiny, a people who have hope and help from heaven. Did you hear me? Many of our people think we are an orphan people, that we don't have a lineage, a history. We don't have a yesterday, that we have never contributed to civilization when we created civilization. Thank you, Reverend Kim. Yeah, post-traumatic slave syndrome by Joy DeGraw is very powerful. There are people, many of our people that we have got to influence and impact, y'all, because we have got to have a Passover memorial that is forever. That reminds us, like it reminded the African Israelites, that we have never been a slave. We have never been slaves. We were enslaved, but we have been survivors and thrivers. That we are not a broken people. We are a blessed and beloved people. And that we have never been an orphan people. We are a people of history and of destiny, and we have hope and help from heaven. God is the one who got us through the enslavement in chattel slavery. It wasn't Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln didn't want to do it. And then when he did it, his first intention was to send all of us back to Africa. Read your history. Lerone Bennett Jr., Forced into Glory is the title of his book. Lerone Bennett Jr., Forced into Glory is the title of the book. Abraham Lincoln, after he could not avoid freeing black people, then he said, I'm going to ship every one of them back to Africa. That's what he thought. Abraham Lincoln didn't free us. America didn't free us. Good white people didn't free us. God freed us. But here it is. Just like God did in Egypt with the Israelites, God partnered with us. God didn't do it all by God's self. God said, you got to partner with me so that you get a chance to work to show what you can do, and what you can't do, I will do. And what you can do, I will bless. Are you listening to me? So we came through the period of chattel slavery because of those uprisings. They don't talk about it. What started the Civil War was, yes, the North didn't want the South to make all the money off of us. But what else started the Civil War is the plantation owners in the South were living in fear because black folk were uprising periodically, and it was blowing their minds. Black folk were not only escaping, but they were having rebellion from, and Nat Turner, you're right, Giovanni was one of them. He had the biggest one of what we call the big three, but Reverend Gabriel Prosser, Reverend Denmark Vesey, Reverend Gabriel Prosser in 1800, Reverend Denmark Vesey in 1822, Gabriel Prosser in Richmond, Virginia, Reverend Denmark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina, and then Reverend Nat Turner in Southampton, Virginia. And notice all of them were ministers, reverends, and the people that participated, the black folk, they were ministers. They were people of faith also, because they recognized that the scriptures, starting with Exodus, demonstrated that you don't give in to this thing, you fight it. And so the Civil War was fought because we was acting up. We were not going along. So God points out, we're not an orphan people. God has been partnering with us. And God has still been partnering with us. The problem is that we fall back and want to be like white folk. We want to have what white folk have. We want to live like white folk live. And we want to think like white folk think. And so we think we got to have white people in everything that we do. You don't. We can run cities and nations and states, and we can run businesses and corporations, and we can run our own communities. When we say defund the police, take all that money. You don't have to, you take all the money you put in policing us. You don't need all that money to police us. Take some of that money and put it into these other areas where we can then develop in our own communities, our leaders, our businesses, our abilities to organize and control our own communities. I get it, Shirlene, and I'm almost done. You're not gonna miss anything, because I'm wrapping up right now. I'm about done. So God partners with us. So when you look at that Passover, remember, it didn't celebrate a prayer meeting. It didn't celebrate that God got them back in, back in worship. God said, "Let my people go so they can worship me on this mountain." But God didn't come down. The Egyptians were keeping them from worshiping. No, God came down because of a political reason, because they were being oppressed. And God said, I can't stand this anymore. And God came down for our people to deliver us from chattel slavery, and has been delivering us from Jim and Jane Crow as we partner with God. As we recognize that God is with us in this, but we got a part to play. We've got our part to be active in. Worship, here it is. Worship is fuel for the fight. So when we gather in worship, now virtually, and when we get a chance to get back together, it is fuel so that we can then go out Monday through Saturday and be the change in our communities. It's not for us to get fed and get fat and sit around during the week because we got the Holy Ghost on Sunday. No, it's for us to get fuel so that we can be active Monday through Saturday in ministries that help illustrate that God is with us in this. So I hope it's helpful. We're gonna get more of it on Sunday in a different context. If you want to read ahead for Sunday's sermon, look at John the 11th chapter. Yeah, John the 11th chapter. You can read the whole chapter, and we're gonna and I'm gonna use one of our more familiar spiritual. I ain't gonna tell you what it is. Anytime, Reverend Kim, you let me know, I'll be there. So I'm not gonna tell you the spiritual, that'll be the title of the sermon, but you know it real well. You know it real well. So yeah, as we look at our scriptures show us how to address the inequities as we partner with God and illustrate to us how to see our journey. We are a people, we're not an orphan people. We are a people of history and destiny, a people who have help and hope from heaven. All right, yep. John chapter 11, the Gospel of John chapter 11. Lazarus. Really, Mary and Martha. Yeah. All right, y'all. Don't forget about the prayer call in the AM 5:45 tomorrow morning, Wednesday. Our prayer call at 5:45. Our midweek prayer call 5:45. Um, so yeah, I will see you on that prayer call. And again, God bless you. Be encouraged. I'm so glad the tomb was empty. Take care now.